This is a video about the Arian controversy, or the divinity of Jesus in the early church. It's part one, an analogy and an explanation. To understand the controversy, it's important to understand what it was about, the people involved, the politics, the culture, and more. There's far more involved than what will be covered, but this should give you a framework to appreciate what was talked about. To start, I'm going to look at the ideas involved. But how do you understand something that cannot be seen? We're going to use an analogy. It will seem simple, but trust me, it will get harder. Have you ever braided hair? The hair all belongs to one person, and you separate it into 3 different strands, and then you start weaving it together to make one braid. That's braiding hair. When you finally finish doing all that work, you end up with 3 separate strands that have now been united into one single braid. The analogy is straightforward. The Nicene Creed states that we have one God, the Father Almighty, one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit of God. This is the Trinity, the triune God. So, one God, one braid, 3 strands of the same God. But remember, the braid is just an analogy, something to help us understand that which cannot be seen. What if my niece decided to color her hair, and her sister said, you know, I can really relate to that purple strand, and her brother said, I prefer the green strand. Again, there's no problem there. Her mom likes the golden strand. That's fine. Everybody can have their own preference of what strand they like, but the strands are still just strands of a braid. But let's say she colors it differently, and other people start talking. One person says, one strand was like gold and is to be valued above all else, and one strand it's like sapphires, and while it's not as good as a gold one, it's still pretty decent. But that 3rd strand, it looks more like mud. It's obviously not very prized. The person says, well, I think the blue strand stands on its own. Somebody else says, well, I think we should just keep the blue and gold strands, but they don't belong on the niece. They're obviously separate and far different. Well, my niece would not be too happy about all of those comments. Come on, we're just talking about braids. Who really cares? Well, what if your job depends on what strand you prefer? Or what if you pick the right strand, you get a job in Hawaii, and of course a paid home? Wrong strand, same work, less pay, also a paid home, but it's in Aberdeen, South Dakota. If you pick the wrong strand, no job, and you're kicked out of Hawaii to a small town in northern Canada, lose all your retirement and health benefits. What if a lot depends on what strand you pick? If there are that many ways to disagree about something as simple as a braid, how many more is there about something as complex as God? If Jesus was created by God, did he always exist? Or did he come about before Adam, before the earth? If Jesus is God, then do we believe in multiple gods? Did he really feel any pain when crucified? If Jesus is a man, then how did his sacrifice save us? Those are just a few questions. Let's take a look at the Arian controversy. And in its simplest form, it can be expressed by the thoughts of 2 different theologians. The first being Arius, from 256 to 336. He claimed that the Word was not God, but the first of all creatures. The Word did exist before the Incarnation, but had been created by God. Followers of his were called Arians. An Arian motto would be, there was when he was not. The second theologian is Bishop Alexander. He was the Bishop of Alexandria from 313 to about 328. And he argued that the Word was divine and therefore could not be created, but rather was co-eternal with the Father. Both theologians agreed that the Word was Jesus Christ. And while the differences between these two statements might seem like splitting hairs, from these statements, many other people drew many different conclusions. And in fact, Arius, who the Arians took their name from, was not the first nor the primary theologian to develop the idea, nor was it a static idea. It took many different shapes, both before Arius and after him. And to get a better feel for the conflict, which officially lasted from 312 to about 486, we need to look a little closer at the area, cultures, and history of the people involved. In other words, it's time to leave behind the braided hair and plunge into some geography and history. We're really talking about the Roman Empire being the basis of where all this took place. And the Roman Empire was divided around 284. Now, it was still the Roman Empire. Dividing it just made it easier to govern. There were theoretically two emperors, one for the west and one for the east. But occasionally, one person would decide to rule both divisions. This lasted until 476, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, with Rome being overtaken by the Germanic general Odoacer. The Eastern Roman Empire, which after this was then called the Byzantine Empire, it lasted quite a bit longer, until 1453, when it was finally overtaken by the Ottomans. The early Christian church went through various times of acceptance and persecution until about 312, and that's when Constantine the Great took over the Western Roman Empire. In 313, in large thanks to Constantine the Great, the Edict of Milan was issued, which declared tolerance for Christianity. In 324, Constantine the Great became the emperor of both the Western and Eastern empires, and he started to use the Christian church as the official state church of the Roman Empire. Well, what was going on here in terms of cities and people? And I'm only going to look at a few of them. But the Roman Empire was originally governed from Rome. Rome was a city whose primary function was to govern. It had people who governed. It had people who supported those people who governed. It had soldiers, and that's about all it did. All those people needed to eat, and they weren't producing any food. So they needed food shipped to Rome. And the place that could produce that food was down here by the Nile. And the place that shipped all that food to Rome was Alexandria. Alexandria was a very rich city, rich in terms of money, and they exported grain to Rome. Now, all those farmers who were farming, they didn't make a lot of money. Farmers never do. But the people who did all the shipping, they made a lot of money. In addition to being very rich in terms of money, it was also rich in terms of culture and people and diversity. It had Egyptians, it's in Egypt. It had Greeks. It had Romans. It had a large Jewish population. It had Christians. And all of those philosophies and theologies and ways of learning were all represented in Alexandria and were exchanged a lot. They all talked between each other. There was another city that did a lot of trading that was also fairly wealthy in terms of money, and that was Antioch, right over here. Now, they didn't have as much food to export, but they had silks and spices from other areas out east, and they also exported. They were also a very diverse city, too. If Rome only governed, we could think of it as being similar to, say, Washington, D.C. Alexandria, very diverse, very wealthy, big port. We could think of it as similar to New York City. Antioch was also very diverse and a large port, but not quite as rich as Alexandria. We could think of it kind of as Chicago. Although this is a New York City and Chicago in a much nicer climate zone. Big cities making money. This guy, big city, important, full of a lot of important people, doing a lot of governing. Constantine said, Rome, you're a really nice city, but all the problems that I have to send soldiers to are pretty much over in this region and then over far east here. And I can't really wait for my orders to get from Rome over to here. So I'm going to move the area that the Roman Empire is being governed from. I'm going to make a new city. And since I'm Constantine and I'm building this city, I'm going to call it Constantinopolis. Now, Constantinopolis was built on a much larger scale on a smaller city called Byzantine, which is why eventually this Eastern Roman Empire is called the Byzantine Empire. Right now, it's called Constantinopolis, and he wanted to have a pretty fancy city, and he said, you know what? Anything I can carry, I'm going to move from Rome over to here. And that includes the major senate, includes statues, paintings, didn't include the Parthenon or the large amphitheaters. Can't move those easily. But everything else, man, he moved them over to Constantinopolis. And that then became the new governing city for the entire Roman Empire. Now, Rome itself is still considered the governing city for the Western Roman Empire. Rome is still an important city, but not as important as Constantinopolis. The other little city I've got on here is Nicaea. Not that that's a big city or important, except that it's where the Nicene Creed was created. Notice it's very close to Constantinopolis and to where Constantine is. So it had a lot of politics going on in it. It's kind of an overview of some of the important cities for this discussion. Not only the only important cities around, though. Let's take a look at some of the people and some of the ideas. Here in Alexandria, there was a guy earlier on, before Constantine the Great, called Origen. He was in Alexandria around 184 to 253. And Origen helped to develop and spread the doctrine of Logos. Well, what is Logos? Logos, word, or reason of God, were all stand-ins for Jesus Christ. So if you said Logos, it was understood you meant Jesus. If you said the word, it was understood you meant Jesus. If you said reason of God, it was understood you meant Jesus. The word or reason of God is capable of direct relationships with the world and with humans. It stands between the immutable one and the mutable word. So between those two, there is the word or logos of God. By the immutable one, they meant God. By the mutable world, we meant everything that changes all around us. It's full of interesting and bizarre and sometimes nasty things. So we, the world, always changes. We are mutable, but God never changes. We're lucky, though, between us is Jesus. And that's what the doctrine of Logos, in simplified terms, meant. While the controversy started in Alexandria, both between Logos and later on Arius, it became popular in the Eastern Kingdom. And the reason of that is because this is where the portion of the church spoke Greek rather than Latin. So if you spoke Greek, then you liked Greek ideas and Greek ways of discussing things, and that's what Logos was all about, the doctrine of Logos. It was written in Greek. It was developed through the Greek philosophy of discussion and rhetoric. When we say it was popular in the Eastern Kingdom, realize that people who didn't speak Greek, so all these farmers here who are still in the Eastern Kingdom, these guys up here who are still in the Eastern Kingdom, some of these guys over here who might not be speaking Greek, they weren't quite as fond of it. But the big thing with the doctrine of Logos is Logos, co-eternal with God. Arius, we talked about them, we already said all this. Arius said the word did exist before incarnation, before the world was created, but it had been created by God. Alexandria said, no, it is co-eternal with the Father. It was not created, it is divine. So this main issue of whether Logos was co-eternal with God is another way of looking at the Arian controversy. And I think that's where we're going to leave this video. The next video, we're going to look at the history of what was going on in the church after 312 and how all of this got argued about and eventually kind of sort of settled. Thank you very much for your time.